Good afternoon. So it's time to start. I don't know if others will be joining us, but in any case, we must not take any longer before we start because the time is limited. And well, I had a battle with Ángel because he wanted to have more time, but he will take the floor for only 25 minutes. So our speakers have a lot of things to say. So today, in this roundtable, we're going to talk about anti-fascist struggles. And this is very important, taking into account the current situation in Europe, where we have the re-emergence of fascism. So we really need to discuss about this because these trends are growing more and more. So now I'd like to give the floor to Ángel del Río. He's a professor of anthropology in the University Pablo de Olavide in Seville. He's delegate in Andalusian of Amical de Mauthausen with many publications, articles, teaching guides, documentaries on the slave work during Francoism and on Andalusians in Nazi concentration camps. So, without further ado, I will just give him the floor.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias, Miguel. Para mí es toda una satisfacción.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Miguel. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with the panelists and with you, the participants. I'm here as the delegate in my quality of delegate in Andalusia of the Amical of Mauthausen. And this is an organization that will be turning 60 next week. It was created in 1962 when the survivors started arriving to Spain from France. There was a meeting in Barcelona because in Catalonia there were more survivors concentrated, and there were also contacts with Perpignan in France where there was the highest number of Republican survivors. They were in France, and this organization was illegal until 1978 when it became legal, and this is still active until today. These people, I was lucky enough to meet them and become friends with them. They are survivors from the Nazi camps from Mauthausen, and if they were still alive, they would all be over 100 years old. And this is the material representation of anti-fascism. Since they were very young, between 16 and 20-something. That was when the military coup took place, and since then they have dedicated their lives to fight against fascism in all its facets. So here we can really see the representation of this cause, of this struggle against fascism, and this is the incarnation of that struggle. And they suffered many consequences from that. They are all linked by several common features. They are anti-fascists, and as you can see in this small group, there's a great diversity because some of them are communists, socialists, anarchists, some of them are only Republicans. But most of Andalusians were there. Well, there were many born in Andalusia, but here we have people who were born in misery. They were peasants with no land of their own. They were just laborers. And they said that they were rebelling against the misery, the humiliation and degradation of misery. They all fought in Spain's war, in the Spanish War, Some of them participated in La Desbandá. They also went to exile through the Pyrenees, also the camps in France, also the company of foreign citizens, some cases the Foreign Legion in France, the prisons camps later on, and then concentration camps in Mauthausen, and extra exile, Uruguay, another dictatorship, another persecution, and so on. Very intense lives that we had to collect before they were lost. I had a great opportunity. I was lucky enough to be able to work with them and collect their testimonies, because these people were found in the last stages, and we could collect their stories, and some of them have been paid tribute to in their villages thanks to that, where no one in fact knew what they had done. In the terms of the research, it was quite new and interesting to interview the family members. We could interview the wives of those people who were deported, and there we got information that the deported people didn't tell us about. Well, the history of lives that we started collecting as anthropologists. Well, most of them lived in France, and we spent several days in different cities and villages in France. And women, particularly the two that you see below, Simone and Christiana, in Brest in Normandy and in Pau in the Pyrenees. And in fact, they met during the anti-Franco protests. That's where they met their future companions. And these women said, they both said, my companion goes to the camps every night, every day. And these experiences, very traumatic experiences, will re-emerge, especially in the last stages of life. This is something that is not forgotten. There we can see a woman holding the picture of her brother, and she learned that her brother had disappeared in a Nazi camp thanks to our research. And we found out absolutely terrible realities, because Nazism had other victims, those people who had no news from their loved ones. So we asked this woman, are you a family member of this person? And she said, have you found him? It's my brother. So it was very hard for us as researchers to inform her of the death of her brother, over 60 years after the death took place. And I was talking to her son, and he was telling me that she was in fact suffering a lot, because it was the mourning. She was mourning, in fact, for her brother, and I wasn't sure it was a good thing to give such bad news to these people. But this woman, she was 92 years old, and the day I was going to talk to her for the interview, she hugged me really strongly and thanked me, because she wanted to know what had happened to her brother. And it was better for her to know that he had died than not knowing at all. Because with that reality, they just cannot stop thinking that, or imagining that perhaps her brother had left in a ship for Argentina or whatever. And it's difficult for them to imagine that they died. So the truth will always be better, will be more better therapy than not having news at all. It is absolutely interesting to do these kind of interviews because many of these women discovered the truth about their loved ones. In this case here, the two women up in the picture on the right, she wasn't born during the La Desbandá. A few months later, she was born after La Desbandá, and her father left with La Desbandá, and it was thanks to our researcher that she found her father's name on a list, and that's when she learned that her father was dead. Here you can see, of course, that was a terrible piece of news for her. Here we have many publications on this. But 10, 15 years ago, when I asked them, what do you know about Mauthausen? They had no idea. They have never heard that word before. If we said the concentration camps in Mauthausen, where there were Andalusian people and Spanish people, they were really shocked, and sometimes even they felt offended, because the concentration camps, in their minds, it was just for the use, and they couldn't believe some people from their own villages had been there. And during the last few years, we've seen an incredible evolution, growth in terms of publications, essays, journalist essays, biographies, books, memory books written by the people that were deported and that have been recovered recently, that have become bestsellers. Also abroad, these are sold graphic novels, documentaries that have been shown in TVs, in cinemas, also teaching guides that are used in some teaching, in some schools for young people, adults, and the university. And also there's been a great penetration in culture. Here we have a book, Violinista de Mauthausen, also the film of the photographer of Mauthausen that has been viewed by thousands of people. There have also been some theater plays that have had a great success in Spain, in France, in Argentina, in many countries, and they have received awards. And well, this is fantastic in terms of a golden age of information about Mauthausen and about the deported people. So now when I asked my students, they more or less know what it is. Here, this is a public event and an acknowledgement in the Amigal of Mauthausen. We are doing a lot of plaques. We need to update the lists all the time. In Seville recently, this memorial was inaugurated, and up there you have the picture of the memorial from Cordoba with over 350 names. We also have the memory stones. This started in the 90s in Cologne, in Germany. It is a micro-monument, or even an anti-monument, because it's like saying, okay, we cannot express the magnitude of the massacre of the Holocaust. Here we have this small plate, and here we have the name, where we say, well, this person worked here or lived here, and he was deported, and he died in that or that other camp. There are over 30,000 memory stones throughout Europe, also in other continents, and in Spain we see this more and more. Many municipalities that a German artist, Gunther something, is doing with this purpose. So, of course, we all know that there were many Spanish people in the German camps and the Nazi camps. Well, here we have a picture that is very well known. And these photographs, an icon of the last camp that was set free. Well, there we have Juan Camacho. He was one of the people on that picture. And Juan Camacho, no one knows of him here. I always told him, well, you know, if you had been a Frenchman or a German man or a Czech person, whatever, you would have monuments, but not here in Spain. Here we have the photographer of Mauthausen. He gave testimony during the Nuremberg trials. And here he's pointing to a spear. The Minister of the War in Germany, well, there the Spanish people copied the photographs, and the children, the Spanish children that were in the camp, could take them out of the camps, and they gave them to a woman in the village. And thanks to these copies of the pictures, this person could be condemned in Nuremberg. And in Spain, the story of the deportation, well, got to Spain very late in comparison to other countries. The Amical of Mauthausen is a member of the International Committee of Mauthausen that was set up when the camp was still operating, with the gas chamber, the crematorium and everything. And it was set up with the active participation of the Spanish Republicans. 7,000 Spanish Republicans were there in Mauthausen, 5,000 died, but there were many more Hungarians, French, Italian, Polish and Russian people. But the Spanish one had a very long story, a long journey. In all the documents we see references to saying that the Spanish people were the most honest ones. The more they had a great dignity, and this was acknowledged by many of the deported people. So during the liberation of the camp by the Americans, the Spanish prisoners were very active. They signed and drafted and signed a document, Never Again. It was read out loud, and it was signed with 16 national committees. This document, it is said that the participants have fought against fascism during their whole life, that they will not forget the victims and of those who gave their lives because of terror and fascism. The International Committee of Mauthausen is composed of 23 member states, like the Czech Republic, Slovenia, the US, Israel, etc. This is a network, anti-fascist network, that is still operating, and it has had a very important role throughout all these years. The liberation, well, after liberation, on the 1st of October 1945, we have the creation of the Amicale of Mauthausen in France. Then there were some political differences, and the Spanish Republicans and anarchists and so on created the Spanish Federation of those deported and political interns. the people who were freed from the camps were only like 35 or 40 kilos, and they needed many months to recover their health, and then they had to take care of each other. They had to take care of each other for a long time. It was a long process of recovering each other. Then they created these associations to inform the family members of what had happened to the people who died in the camps. That was one of the goals, and that has been a very long process of several decades. Also, they wanted to recover Spain freed from Franco. But this, of course, well, it was a disappointment for them, because they saw that Francoism was kept as it was. And also they wanted to keep alive the memory of the victims, because Mauthausen was, well, on the 5th of May, during the weekend that is closest to the 5th of May, there is a memory event of the liberation of the camp with dignitaries from all the countries from where there were prisoners there. So what did the deported people find when they finally got out of the camp? Here we see some Jews of literature. These books were written right after the people left the camps. So they have not been polluted by anything that, like other books written later on under other influences. Primo Levi sold only like 200 or 300 books, and the one on the left, Kay El Reich, from a Catalonian writer, it is absolutely wonderful. This has been republished, but in any case, these books didn't have any success. These books found the development decades later on, because the people deported from the camps, they found out that the European society was indifferent to them. They felt it was something boring for them. The prisoners, they needed to tell their stories, and they found no one listening, and even people denying what had happened to them. So when I've carried out interviews with survivors, many insisted that they were not lying, because they had found it difficult for other people to believe what they were telling, and it is humiliating, of course, for them when other people have told them that those things were lies, and they suffered a lot from that. Also, all survivors have a terrible feeling of, well, they felt guilty, because they thought that the more generous one were cremated or were burnt in the camps, and they always felt that they survived because at a point or some point they were selfish, because they didn't share a piece of bread with someone else, and that was very hard on them. Also, the Russian prisoners were accused of having collaborated with the Nazis, and that was also the case for some other European prisoners. So that was all very hard, and they had to overcome all this. And I think this is a very important part of all the suffering they had. And suicide has been the exit for many of the survivors from the camps, because they needed to talk, and they didn't find words to express what they had lived, and no one was listening. Here we have this sentence when they saw the end of Auschwitz, and the SS said, "Whatever the end of this war is, the war against you will have been ours. None of you will be there to tell about what happened, and if you ever manage to escape, no one will believe you. Even if there is a proof, no one will ever believe what you tell, also because the facts have been so terrible that no one in the world will be willing to believe this. So that's also a victory of the Nazis over the people who were deported. In 1962, things changed, and it was when the Amical of Mauthausen was set up in Spain. Some of the trials had taken place. Oh, that's the end of my time. Okay. So there was a person who was judged by the Mossad after he was kidnapped, and this gave a new dimension to the memory of deportation. And that was when this monument was inaugurated in Mauthausen, where there are many different monuments from different countries, and the Spanish one does not belong to a state, but it was built by exiled people in France by themselves. And in the room of the flags, here we see that it is a Republican flag that represents the state of Spain. How many minutes do I have left? Oh, terrible. 2 minutes, if I may. And so I go straight to the end. I was, well, saying here that with Mr. Zapatero, there was a change because memory, well, institutions started participating when we were paying tribute to those memory events, and we worked with students. And if you go to Mauthausen, you will find many plaques with names from Spain and Andalusia, also many other plaques from many other countries in different languages, and a lot has been done. But in any case, I'd like to say 3 extra things. This was the last Spanish survivor from Cordoba who died. He was 101 years old a year ago. And I wanted to refer to 3 things very quickly. A part of the community of historians are starting to decide not to use testimonies or the memory because they think it is a non-liable source. And for me, that's terrible. So they think that the document that was written by the one that actually carried out the actions, you can believe that, but you cannot believe something coming from the victims. The perpetrator is believed, but not the victim. That's terrible. Also, there are the risks of all the trends to review, to deny, and trivialize the facts. People using sentences like, well, these people are going to be even hungrier than the Spanish people who went to Mauthausen. And it was good to see that people didn't laugh at that. And we kind of see this trend too. Also the memory of deportation, we've tried it to become a collective heritage. And we wanted to acknowledge the prisoners. And here in Andalusia, it's always the left parties who brought the initiatives, and nevertheless the political party always voted in favor, so we were unified, and it was a unity in the memory events. But since Vox, that is not the case. Also, anti-fascism is key. It is not only racism and other things, but we need to really fight fascism in order to defend cultural diversity and human rights. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking so long.
Thank you so much, Ángel, for this wonderful presentation. Very well presented and explained about the situation of the prisoners who in the end are even not believed. Stefanie Schuler-Springorum, she is a professor of contemporary history in the Technical University of Berlin, director of the Research Center of Anti-Semitism and the Jewish European Story. She's written a book on the Condor Legion, the war as an adventure. and many publications on the Jewish communist resistance and the gender history. I'm going to give the floor to Stefania.
Ahora sí. Pues muchas gracias. Gracias por la invitación.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me. I am very impressed with this event, and I'm going to try to offer something from a German perspective when we talk about the development of the German historic memory and its problems as I see them, because not everything is great in my country. To start with, I would like to get out of the real or historical world to the world of fiction and of the novel, the world of novels. Robert Harris, a British writer, wrote a novel that took place in fictitious Berlin of the 60s. Germans in this novel had not lost the war. They hadn't won it because in Kiev they were still fighting. There was a partisan war nobody knew a lot about, because at some point the United States had decided to break this anti-Nazi alliance, and since then there was peace in Western countries. Nazis were still in power, but the dictatorship was not so harsh, and the welfare of people was increasing year by year. And the victims? Well, the victims of the Nazi regime were not talked about. They just knew that a long time ago there were Jewish people. There was Jewish people in Germany who disappeared or were deported to the east, but nobody knew exactly what had happened to them. Maybe they died somehow, but the truth is that that was not interesting for anybody else. When I read this novel, I got the shivers, because this description is very frightening, because it could have been like that, and we know that here in Spain. Well, history was not like that, like in this novel, thank God, or thanks to the Soviet army, and Germany lost the war and was occupied and surveilled for decades. My country had started an offensive war, on a brutal war that was the war of exterminium, mostly in East Europe. As a result, 50 million people died, among them 30 million civilians. In the occupied places, 19 million of which were Soviet civilians. 1/5 of the Polish population, 6 million European Jewish, 1.5 million Jewish children, that is to say 90% of all Jewish children in the Europe of that time. If we have a look at this catastrophe in its dimension, that is unprecedented, what impresses us is that the Germans started to rationalize it very soon, saying, okay, we just turn the page and that's it. In Germany, that is the mentality of the period, or the full stop. One of the great thinkers of the 20th century, German Jewish one, that in the year 1946, a year after the war, when she came back to her homeland after the war, she was very impressed because of the lack of reaction, of emotional reaction by the Germans. There was no anger, no sadness, no guilt, no empathy, nothing. The only thing that she could see, some reaction, is that when she introduced herself as a Jew, then there was an avalanche of self-exculpation and also a list of German suffering. Alan said, anti-Semitism was never greater than after the war. Before this mentality and trend, it's very clear that everything that in the end developed positively, the policy of historical memory in Germany, that was due to the allies in the West and the East. And also because of the fact that the Germans had lost the war. the Federal Republic Foundation. Up to that, I'm just going to talk about the Federal Republic because the Democratic Republic is a different story, and maybe we can talk about that later on in the debate. But before the establishment of this Federal Republic, so from 1945 and 1949, there was a number of people that were charged with war crimes and against humankind. These trials gave rise in their time to documentaries and reports on crimes in newspapers. There was much debate. That is to say, we could know what happened with the knowledge that we had then. If you were interested in it, you could access that information. In the 50s, it is not true that we didn't talk about the war, partly about its atrocities, but it was talked about in a certain way, the self-justification and also the German victimism. It's like, yeah, that happened, but Germans also had to suffer because I remember this and that, the bombing of the Allies, cities that were destroyed, war prisoners in the Soviet Union, and the 12 million Germans expelled from the Eastern territories. So topics that came back as zombies to the public life of the Federal Republic up until today, I would say. It is also true, however, that since the founding of the Federal Republic in the year 1949, the trials against the Nazis stopped. Not only that, many German prisoners that were arrested by the Allies were set free by the German government, and even more, they kept their jobs, their positions. So we can talk about a nearly complete continuation from National Socialism to the Federal Republic. Not Hitler, etc., but at the level of, army officials, the Secret Service, that between brackets had helped Franco build the Secret Service here. Also the police, the diplomatic service, the legal system, university professors, doctors, businessmen. And so that social class stayed there where it was in 1939, more or less. We need to know about all of this when we want to understand what happened in the year 1968. A new generation went against their fascist parents, a continuation of the elite in the society. This was more a family rebellion. It was a political one, but it was a family rebellion, while the real victims were not interesting for anybody. On the contrary, the revolutionary youngsters then had the trend of imagining themselves as the victims of their Nazi parents and the German police state that counterattacked in the great protests of the year 1967 and 1968, and when they talked about the anti-terror fight of the 1970s. As a consequence, what people were interested in the 70s, the new generations in universities, schools, and also the media, was more the fight, the social fight, social history, and regarding the past, the administrative working of it and the economic system of the Nazis from a Marxist point of view, the history of anti-Nazi resistance, communist resistance, social democratic one, etc. The German and Jewish and the Holocaust history seemed to be something, that's not very interesting, something we know about, something more for medieval or legal studies. So, of course, interviewing victims was out of the way. This changed significantly after the year 1979. So, that is to say, even nearly 40 years after all the facts. Once again, the United States gave us a lesson in history, because in Germany we imported the TV series Holocaust. Maybe some of you know about it. It's a great Hollywood drama, and German intellectuals said it was very quiche, very tacky. But these TV series had a great impact in the general public, because it was the first time 40 years later that the Germans faced the suffering of their victims. where the victims were presented as individuals and not as just a bunch of anonymous corpses. Since from there was an interest in the Jewish history before and after the Nazi regime. In the 80s, we saw the beginning of a boom. They created history workshops in many places, and they talked about history from the bottom up, so the history of the daily life and also the Jewish of the different villages. A colleague of mine considers that this coming back to the village had to do with what happened in the year 68 when they were not happy with the revolution that was put to an end. So these teachers in schools or universities focused now on the search for what they call the experience of normal people. So the day by day of the dictatorship, but also the persecution of the Jewish, and that was in the center of attention. So, but these started more as like a local movement, something that is part of what's happening in your homeland. So there were many films, publications, academic research projects, Jewish exhibitions in the places where the camps were. This was all the result of this first commemorative stage that ended in the year 1988 with the 50th anniversary of the Night of the Glass. And never again, all those so many articles have been published 50 years after those facts.
La unificación de...
With the unification of Germany in 1990, this attitude towards the past extended towards the east of Germany, where it clashed against a culture and a memory policy which was very different, which led to many conflicts. As I said, it's a very complicated topic that maybe we can talk about later on. But we could say that these conflicts were solved as the German unification conflicts were solved in a colonial way. So the Western memory was imposed to East Germany, so they lost a different culture of anti-fascism. With so much memory activity, up to the beginning of the 90s, they thought, okay, yes, we know about it, the post-war has finished, and that's how our president said that in 1995, 50 years after the war, the end of the Second War. But again, it wasn't like that. When they said, after they said that, a second commemorative stage started in the country, and this time it was really hard, because the Germans themselves, those who showed indifference, were in the center of attention. In the academic world, suddenly everybody talked about the research on the authors of those crimes, the direct killers and assassins, something like 200,000. Out of which, of course, only a minimal part of had to face justice. With books by historians like Christopher Browning, from the United States, on these normal killers, this massive participation started firstly in public in Germany, and then there was an exhibition that brought down the pre-last myth of the clean army. The idea that the army went to war, but it was clean of those war crimes, of the dirty stuff. But we know now that it wasn't like that. And also there was an exhibition with 1,000 pictures of undeniable evidence of what an exterminium war was, what a genocide was, and perpetrated by the army, mostly in the Soviet Union. This exhibition that in the second half of the 90s traveled across many German cities brought about a very big debate that got to the parliament and the streets, where veterans of the war and their children and grandchildren defended for the last time the facts in relation to this German army. In the year 2000 and on, they investigated the co-authors of the crimes, for example, diplomats of the foreign Affairs Ministry and other ministries, because these ministries had to have a book on their history. And what's interesting about this and many other works is that they do not only deal on the participation in Nazism, but also of the covering of these crimes and their authors. The story of the Federal Republic of these years and the integration of elites in the new Federal Republic. For historians, the academic work of the last 20 years have shown tirelessly that we cannot talk about the Nazis and the village as two different entities, but the whole of the German society, with the exception, of course, of the resistance itself. But because the whole of the German society was involved somehow, some more and some less, in the dictatorship and its crime. So it's a dictatorship of consensus at the end of the day. To understand this historic situation, in the last few years, they have researched a lot the community of the nation or of the village. This word in German, Volk, it's a little bit ambiguous. It's like nation or village. So these had a very strong link to reality when you investigated, for example, in practice, how they got organized, who was integrated, who was expelled, and how it worked. For example, we can imagine a village like Winan with the social texture of a village like that. If some young people can mistreat the chemist owner, an old person, a Jew, and if it's only 10 youngsters that beat him, but 50 that see it and do nothing about it, then something changes in that village. And the investigation of those participation mechanisms and that violence and that indifference and maybe shame are the ones that will lead us to a wider and a better knowledge of a dynamic of a dictatorship, of how it works in a collective and individual way. You have two more minutes. Five. I've got 5. Can I? So, we could say that Germany has gone far in this road in the academic world and in the sector of public commemoration. We've gone so far that nowadays Germany serves as an example to many other countries regarding how to deal with this topic. In my opinion, this is very ironic and bitter. It's like first we kill you and then we teach you how to remember it properly. But we mustn't forget two fundamental things. This politically correct memory is no good for the victims that have had to live with the silence and the lack of interest that was present in the first 40 and 50 years after the war. Many of them died without this recognition. And secondly, since the 80s, we can observe medialization of the Holocaust. In Germany, we've seen, well, we have a small pictures museum, historical pictures museum, pictures of films, and sometimes all of it gets mixed. And in my opinion, this is a problem because the approach in the Holocaust, as important as it is, at the same time, now in Germany, it can serve to cover the mechanisms that led us to this point. That is to say, how they destroyed the Republic, the German Republic, and why that was done, and who did it, and with what objective, and how this dictatorship was set up, and who benefited from it, from the war, etc. So the political and social history and economic history, which is behind all of this, is disappearing little by little in the public consciousness. I can see that with my students, and there are also German statistics that show very clearly, and this is something that we need to take into account here, that historical knowledge is decreasing among young people in Germany. So among the generation that has grown up with the greatest with the greatest possibility of knowledge, and this is very worrying in my opinion, and it's a bad prospect for the future. So what maybe we can do, we can learn from the German example, which is very different from the Spanish one. The recovery of historical memory is not something static. It is a slow process that comes in stages, and that has to do with who won the war. Those who win write history, and only when they die they open the space to other political generations, other memories and other histories. This has happened in Germany, in Spain, and you can also see it in East countries. But I think that only recovering the historical memory with what's as essential as it is, we will not go very far if we're lacking a real knowledge and a deep understanding of the political and social mechanisms that have led to these events. With this wave of anti-fascist fascists in Europe and the far-right political parties, we see how weak our consensus is. A few years ago, we thought, okay, this is done. This is a lesson learned, and that belongs to the 20th century. But still, I think we have a lot of work to do ahead for the 21st century. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Stephanie, por tu exposición y por esa advertencia.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for this, for your presentation and for this warning regarding the problems with memory. Olga is going to talk now, representative of the memorial of Olga Arcos. She's the granddaughter of exiled family, and she's interested in the topic of the recovery of democratic memory. She's conscious of the importance that public policies and institutions get involved in the topic of recovery and reparation. So she's been managing the memorial of one of the camps where the Spanish Republicans were locked when they were running away from the fascists. She wants you to know about her story and recover the oral memory of those who were in the camp. They organize exhibitions and tribute, and also they promote the cooperation with other European institutions. With her, we have the mayor of Argelès-sur-Mer, Antoine Parra. He's a teacher, a primary school teacher. Is the mayor of the city since the year 2016. And he's convinced of the importance of the recovery and transmission of the memory, which is linked to the Republican Spanish exile and this camp we mentioned before. He's developed actions in relation to this, and he has promoted the creation of a network of places of memory around Argel, and also in other places of the territory where events took place, events related to the Republicans that had fled from fascism. He's still the mayor, and his main objective is to develop this work in the future, opening a more important memorial center that integrates some pedagogical spaces and strengthening the cooperation with other memorial institutions. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our colleagues from France. Good afternoon.
Pues primero quisiera dar las gracias por.
First of all, I would like to thank you for having invited us to take part in this conference. Thank you so much to the organization. I would like to congratulate you on the work that you have done, this very essential work that you're doing against oblivion. This commitment is something we're going to mention in our speeches for Antoine and for me. representing the memorial of the camp of Argelès. It is an honor for us. We have a very strong feeling being here with all of you and being able to present the work that we have done in Argelès. First of all, we're going to show a short video so that you can quickly see what we do there.
Argelès-sur-Mer. In a unified Europe, we need aspire not to repeat the same mistakes. We need to keep memory alive. Our commitment with this memory is something we owe. Argelès-sur-Mer will not forget the retreat and the camps from 1939. In a reunified Europe that is looking towards the peace, we need to remember and keep those memories alive. My name is Antoine Parra. I'm the Major of Argelès-sur-Mer, and on behalf of the city, it is a great honor and duty for me to talk to you about a terrible event of our history. In our wonderful beach, where tourists enjoy so much, a tragic event took place, and it has been silenced for a long time. It is a Spanish history, a French history, a European history, that of the Spanish Republican exile and the imprisonment in the sand of Argelès of hundreds and thousands of women, men and children. Our commitment with this memory is something that history demands on behalf of dignity. We owe that to those who suffered this, and our responsibility is to convey this democratic memory to future generations. We do this, we keep the memory alive with our places for memory and also the memorial of the Argelès-sur-Mer camp. I hope to see you soon here in Argelès-sur-Mer.
Gracias.
Thank you.
A ver, para contexto.
So, can you hear me? So I'd like to give you some background information, and I'd like to go over quite quickly I'd like to go over what happened in 1939, and also I'd like to refer to the silence that has been imposed during so many years. For those who don't know this subject well enough and what the Argelès-sur-Mer camp was, I'd like to remind you all what it was. Well, the Spanish Republican exile those years, and it's not that far away in time because some of the witnesses are still alive, and these people in France were seeing the Spanish Republicans arrive at the end of the war. And of course, in France, people expected perhaps 10,000, 20,000 or 30,000 refugees, but not more. That was already quite a big volume, big numbers. But the truth is that between January and February, so the fall of Barcelona and Catalonia's front line, nearly 500,000 refugees crossed the border between Andorra and the Mediterranean coast. This refers to the Eastern Pyrenees in France. At the time, there was a population of 240,000 people, and 500,000 people arrived. So the border was officially opened by the French authorities during the night of the 27th of January for the civilian population and the wounded, and on the 5th of February, the border was opened to the soldiers of the Republican Army. And the border was officially closed on the 13th of February. But of course, other people started crossing, continued crossing through the mountains. So this led to the creation of two different areas of transit and control of the refugees. There were centers, evacuation centers for civilians, the elderly, the wounded, women and children, and then camps for the men. Those camps were installed along the border, the border in the Pyrenees, where they wanted to group the military groups in order to later on create convoys that would be going to concentration camps using the terms that were used at the time. The Argelès camp started being settled at the end of the month of January, was key because many of the soldiers were taken there, as well as some women and some men and members of the international brigades. It is estimated that about 110,000 refugees were in the camp between January and June of 1939, and this means that this was the biggest of all camps in the area. And why this camp? That was the first of these camps too. The reason was not so much that of the proximity to the border. The Eastern Pyrenees, well, that's a long border in any case, but there is a geological element that is key. It is the first place where you find a beach when you come from Spain. So the coast up to that point, it's a stone coast, but the beach was an open area where it was easy to accumulate thousands of people. These were more or less thrown on the sand because there's nothing, just the sea, the sand, and barbed wire. They are locked there. It was the winter of 1939 with degrees of 10 or 12 degrees below zero. So one of the coldest winters in the century, and people excavated holes in the sand. With time, they started building barracks, and in September 1939, France started fighting in the war, and then the laws again on the foreigners became harder, and then those people who were called the undesirable foreigners, so populations from Eastern Europe that had been fleeing from the Reich troops, some Jews and some Roma people. Those were imprisoned, and then at the end of 1942 or beginning of the 1943, the camp was finally closed. And they were fearing that the disembark on the coast, because on November 1942 there had been the Allies had disembarked on in Northern Africa, so they wanted to dismantle this camp in order to do military maneuvers. So after that, nothing was left. And during many years, there's been a complete void in this that we call the beach of the exile, the beach of the defeat, the beach of the pain and despair. And a void also like the silence that has been kept on the facts. So when we don't talk about something, it's like it had never existed. What Javier Cervera often says, a good friend of ours who visits us, he's a writer, and that was the case for many years. There was a layer of silence on the history of our own village, on what happened on our beach, and what the concentration camp of Argelès-sur-Mer and what it was and what it represented. So Argelès finally decided to take this layer of silence away, remove it completely, and free the word. There were some groups working on memory, a few associations or groups of interest on memory, but nothing had been done by the institutions. And the town council of Argelès started working on this with this institutional perspective. This was a taboo. There was guilt. There was some sort of shame too. And well, finally, there was a political decision with all its consequences. So there was this municipal action, and then at the same time, the Free Association was created, and this is where we have Amparo Sanchez Monroy that spoke to you yesterday, and she was the founder of this association that gathers children and friends of the exiled from Spain. And we keep a very close relationship with the Free Association. And since 1999, so over 2 decades ago, that we've been working on this, and we've organized different types of events, also these debates. We've identified the position of the camp. We've got a monolith on the beach to pay tribute to the Spanish Republicans at more or less the place where the gate to the camp was. We have also rehabilitated the Spanish cemetery where we organize every year commemorative events, also with a plaque with the names of people who died in the camp, both adults and children, at least of those that were identified. Also, we created the International Center for the documentation on the Republican exiled people from Spain. And since 2014, as another stage in this work, we created the memorial of the Argelès camp. And thanks to Antoine, it is now in the center of our village since 2016. It is a memorial site. And, well, no one really talked about this. And, well, the camp doesn't exist anymore. So the idea with this center was to sort of recreate that camp with a material representation and also an itinerary of the people there. There is a part that symbolizes Spain. There is a wall that is like the border, and then you reach a different area where you have the camp and France, therefore. So different people come to visit our memorial. Groups from schools. Of course, this is particularly important for us because we want to work with the young generations and teach memory. Also, there are associations that come to visit us. It's associations made of family members of those who were in the camps, or even people who are survivors, and also other people who enjoy memory tourism. Argelès is one of the balneary stations, the centers that is more, quite important in the area. And in spite of this, many people didn't know anything about this part of our history. Many people come to visit us. Also, we've realized that many people come to see us because other previous visitors have told them about their visit to our memorial, and we are receiving about 15,000 visitors a year. We've realized that there's something that is key, and this is very important in our memorial, and that is that this site informs about the memory, but it's also a place where people come to ask for information and are coming for help because they want to know about friends or family members that they've lost. So it's a place where people come and tell you their personal lives or their personal histories, and we listen to them. And, well, that was not our main goal, but the truth is that we've become, quite quickly and in a gradual way, we've become a place where we collect and preserve also the memory and the testimonies of those who were locked in the camp. And we get that from families in Argelès and also in our territory, but also of we receive the testimonies of all sorts of people who've suffered persecution and repression. So we want to increase the network of our network of cooperation with many different actors, and also with this perspective of trying to inform about the memory, with teaching projects, cross-border projects too. Also, we want to support the research on the people who were in the camp, so that we can help people who are looking for information, searching information about their family members. Up to now, we have not created many partnerships. We are a member of a cooperation network with other memory sites. Rives Altes, the maternity of Elna, the Château Royal in Coyou, and also the Museum of the Exili in La Jonquera. And this is a network on memory. And we've also signed other agreements with the association 28th of August 44, the I Carmela Association, and other French associations, but these are technical agreements for projects, specific projects. But we are not members of other conventions or agreements or partnerships, and we don't have sponsors. We only have the municipal funds, although often we obtain limited funds from specific projects, because in Spain there's not a network of the memory sites on the Spanish exiled republics. There are some other networks that do exist, but we are not members of that. And this is why we would like to expand our connections and collaborations, particularly with Spain. This is what we are looking for. We want this memorial to be registered in all sorts of memory associations, groups, centers. And we hoped that the law on the democratic law that has been recently passed will create new opportunities for collaboration for memory body organizations, but also for public institutions. Because in our case, we are both at the same time. This is a memory organization that is in fact has been created by a public institution. And in any case, for us, the main goal is to convey the memory that the words of the interns will be set free and it will never be silenced again. And I will give the floor to Antoine Parra, who is the mayor of Argelès, who is still working very hard on this project and wants to expand it.
Bueno, empezaré por una confesión.
Well, I'm going to start saying that my Spanish is much worse than what you heard in the video, because I had prepared that video a lot. And also I'd like to say that, yes, my surname is Andalusian. My father was born in Huercalovera and my mother in Carboneras, Níjar, and so on. All these villages are villages that I have in my mind because my parents have told me so many stories about those villages, but I've never lived in Andalusia. I am the mayor of Argelès-sur-Mer, and I'm very happy to be here. I was invited and I was happy to accept this invitation. Olga just presented the work we do in our municipality, and I'd like to explain why we do that and what is our political ambition. As I said, my name is Antoine Parra. I am the mayor of Argelès-sur-Mer, and if you ask me how many inhabitants does your municipality have, I'll say, well, I don't know. It may be 10,500 or 150,000, depending on the day. This is a very tourist village, but this is important, one of the main activities of the village. One of the complexities of men and women, because when I say men, I mean mankind, is that many things that happen are difficult to explain. For example, in if there's a football match, Spain and France, I will support Spain. If it's PSG against the Real Madrid, I will be supporting the Real Madrid. If it's Barcelona against the Real Madrid, I will support Barcelona. And why? Because a French poet said, your only country is that of your childhood. And my childhood was divided between the Spanish Catalonian region, and I was born in the Spanish side. At 8 years ago, when I was 8 years, I went to Sergeron de Serjan. It's the very first time you've heard that. And that was in the French side. And so my country is Catalonia. And that's important for me to say so. And you will understand that when I'm going to explain what I have to say here. Because identity is a very important part of what we do in Argelès. In our municipality, we have a very strong ambition for two different reasons. First of all, the mayor of a village and its inhabitants must always accept its history. And this is important because people who come and visit Argelès-sur-Mer, they come to visit us because it is a very authentic village, and we need to accept what we are. We do so in our cuisine, in the way we dress, in the way we live, in the way we change, in the way we walk in the streets. And that's the way, that's our life, that's the way we live. And what we are in a village, the way we live, the way we cook, the way we listen to music, this has been prepared by our the previous generations. And it is those who came before us who defined those manners, the way we do things. It was our ancestors. Argelès-sur-Mer is a village that I love. And there were thousands of refugees, thousands of Spanish Republicans that came, as Olga explained, came to the camp in Argelès, to the beach. It was something absolutely terrible. But many of them stayed in Argelès and its territory. Many of them became a family there. Many of them settled down in the village, dressing or differently, cooking differently. We could smell the Spanish omelette with potatoes, something no one had known up to then. Also, other recipes that we didn't know. Also, we started hearing people speak Spanish in the streets. So this is something that marked the village, and the village became different to other villages surrounding us. And I also value very much our culture, and I'm happy to show it to our visitors. And I am Catalonian, and I'm proud of that. And I'm not talking about politics here. I'm not talking about the independence. I am talking about the culture and the way of living. It's important to accept the village and the village that it accepts itself. Tourists love to visit our village because it's authentic, but this also implies facing reality, and that reality was a terrible shame in 1939, of what happened in 1939, and we didn't want to talk about that for many years because of shame. We silenced that because it's difficult to face shame. And we felt ashamed. But when you finally face those events, that's when you can start finding explanations to the facts. It's true that It was bad behavior, but it was difficult to behave properly. It was a very small village at this time. It had 500 inhabitants. They were peasants, and some days there were tens of thousands of people arriving. It was just in a few days they all arrived. It was impossible to host them properly. I researched this period of time, and I know, therefore, that many people from the village went to distribute some food to the people in the camp. Many of them went by night so that no one saw them. It is a very difficult history, but I think it's important to accept it. And when I became a mayor, one of the first things I did was to move the memorial site that was in the outskirts of the village, and I wanted to bring it to the center of our village because that is our history. Your time is nearly over.
La segunda razón por
There's a second important reason. As the anthropology professor said, this memorial site also offers the possibility to give an answer to people who are looking for answers. It's very painful not to know. People want to find the missing pieces of their puzzle. This is a very strong emotion, and this is why we want to help the visitors that come to Argelès, and we want to help them find those missing pieces. This is very important. My father was born in Huerta Lovera, and when he was 7, he became an orphan. His mother had died a few months earlier, and his father was executed by Franco. When he was 7 years old, he was completely alone. No family, no friends, no one. No one really knows how he survived until he was 14. My father never told us what he did during those 7 years. This is something he never told us. He died in 2015. And for us, well, at the time he had told me, Antonio, I cannot remember if I had 2 brothers and 1 daughter or 3 brothers and 1 daughter. And he died without knowing. So I'm so aware of how difficult it is to live not knowing. So this is why it's important for me to try and help these people fill in the void in the memory. This is why I want to help these people. So that's what I try to do, to help those people fill in the void. Franco destroyed my family. And if I have the opportunity to help other families who were also destroyed, well, this is what I want to do. I think a politician should know how to do the management of a village and decide on revenues and expenses, but a mayor should also know how to help men and women. And therefore, that's what we do in Argelès-sur-Mer, and I would like to welcome you there whenever you wish to come and visit us.
Gracias, Antoine.
Thank you, Antoine. We don't have a lot of time left. For those of you who would like to have some, we've got some leaflets on the memorial we talked about, and there are some others in reception. Unfortunately, we cannot give the floor to the audience because the next session is going to start. It is 5, and the next session has to start. I'm sorry. If you have any question, you can ask them, but outside the conference room. Thank you.
Sí, hubiera debido ser un poco más estricto con los oradores, lo siento.